Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. College football week 3, at least I think they all blend together during the month of September. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. How goes it, my friend? And have you come down off of that emotional high of the Tate Rodemaker success show that we saw in primetime on Friday night?
I have not. College football week 4 upon us, and you're right, they just all blend together. Every single day is the same in this life during football season.
When you look at the college football landscape, obviously it feels like we're playing out the string looking for one team to join the big 3 in the college football playoff, with Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State doing what they do every single week, going out there, beating up on inferior foes, and doing it with style points. We'll see a couple of teams who get their feet put to the fire this week, highlighted by the Michigan Wolverines, who now graduate from playing high school caliber competition into the ranks of college football. Clemson on the road at Wake Forest, just 2 games that we'll get to with Brad Powers a little bit later in the show. But I wanted to give you the opportunity not to deep dive or go through good, bad, and ugly like we do every Monday during the NFL, as far as what we saw unfold last week in college football. I mean, hey, full marks to Kalen DeBoer and Michael Penix. The Washington Huskies actually have an offense that can throw the forward pass.
We thought they would be able to throw the ball against a Sparty secondary that has some question marks. So many question marks. The head coach said, hey, I got to tackle this position myself and coach that unit. But Kalen DeBoer, Michael Penix were fantastic last week, pushing the ball through the air. Had a little late spread drama there. Needed to stop late, but that's an interesting squad. I think we pegged them wrong earlier this summer. It was kind of a sell team, but then as things materialized throughout the course of fall camp, we're like, we don't necessarily love our under win bet at 7.5 there. DeBoer and Penix have just hit the ground running.
Yeah, I mean, you look at their receivers, clearly skill position, talent abounds, but to your point, up 39-14, it looked like that game was dead and buried for those folks that laid the points with Washington. Michigan State never quit, had the ball down 39-28, and almost had the chance for an improbable backdoor for those folks that were laying 3.5. When you look elsewhere in the college football landscape, I think that was more or less the BYU team we would have loved to see the week before when we bet Baylor, who wasn't able to get us to the window as a best bet there. But home Bo Nix, as you highlighted, the Oregon Ducks look to be a legitimate Pac-12 contender. They'll have their hands full this weekend when they head up to the Palouse against a Washington State team that showed no ill effects of a letdown in dismantling Colorado State.
You know what? Obviously, as our listeners know, it's been a little bit of a struggle here with the best bet. But boy, I went back and listened to some of the breakdowns. God, man, if you're playing those things. Yes, we didn't get to the window with Oregon. That was one that, just the number frustrated us a little bit. We're laying it if it's 3. Just didn't quite get there at 3.5, but that's exactly what we thought, right? Oregon's a team that was a little bit underappreciated because of the opening game performance against Georgia, but defensively they showed well with BYU's top 2 receivers being down again. Offensively, Kenny Dillingham got the ground game going, was a little bit more explosive. Bo Nix was fantastic at home in front of that crowd, and that was one that I regret not playing. We're very close there. Another game that was in the evening, probably wanted, if you watched it in its entirety, probably pulled your eyes out. That was another game that I thought we pegged quite well with A&M and Miami going under the total. Just 2 offensive performances that were exactly what we expected. Jimbo Fisher running on first down and forcing his quarterback to throw from behind the chains on third down, and a Miami offense with Josh Gaddis that we thought would be a little inept. And how inept was it? 9 points. Obviously had some negative red zone variance, had some kicks blocked, but it's a group that does not have the requisite receivers. It's a quarterback that missed some throws that were wide open. It's a stale offense, and when you get Mario Cristobal as your head coach, you can expect things like being down 17-3 and on 3rd and 6 from the 8-yard line running and then kicking a field goal to make a two-score game. And that's ultimately what we saw unfold with A&M and Miami. The crazy part about that game, and this just sheds some light on the problems Miami's having offensively, is that before that game, A&M's starting cornerback was suspended. And about a quarter into that game, A&M's starting safeties were both ejected for targeting. 3 guys out in the secondary. 9 points of offense for good old Josh Gaddis.
You begin to wonder if Tyler Van Dyke is truly enjoying his Mario Cristobal experience as he sees his draft stock plummet. But rest assured, Tyler, if it's any consolation, we saw Mario Cristobal try and railroad Justin Herbert. Things have worked out quite well for him in the National Football League, and we'll hope that you have a chance to realize your full potential with a forward thinker on the offensive side of the ball. But so many interesting storylines. The games have not been great on paper, but we get a much better indication of all these teams are. One other side that I did want to highlight as well, I think a game that'll go under the radar, Texas taking care of an in-state rival, theoretically, in UTSA. We saw the Roadrunners take money early in the week. Number got bet up a little bit as they were banged up on the offensive line, but Texas found a bit of separation late, end up winning that game rather comfortably in what should have been a letdown spot. So
thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, you know what? Every now and again, we have to rehash some of it. We, of course, were on the under in that game, and it wouldn't be an under bet for us if it wasn't without a defensive touchdown or special teams touchdown. I think that's the contract we signed. But the reason I say that is because that's a kind of game where Texas, that wasn't mentally strong in the past, might have lost or let an inferior team hang around for 4 quarters. So maybe we're seeing a turning of the tides, even with a backup quarterback for the Longhorns. But I digress.
Had to battle from behind, too, right? UTSA got out early in that game.
Yeah,
You're thinking to yourself,
think, right?
Same old Texas. And then all of a sudden, a less than 100% Hudson Card turned it on. Bijan Robinson took over the game, and UTSA eventually wore out late.
Yeah, it's so fascinating when you watch these teams and the little things that we look for more so than just the scoreboard watching. You see those wheels spin. You see coaches making better decisions. You try and watch the body language of programs that have aspirations of conference championships that have been downtrodden over the years if they're finally able to get over the hump. And Texas showed me an awful lot. We can probably count the days until we'll see Texas on full display in the Red River rivalry against Oklahoma should the Sooners do their part in the weeks leading up to it. But enough about what we saw and what we may see in the future. Let's get into the meat and potatoes portion of the program. He joins us every Wednesday to break down the biggest games on the college football slate. He, of course, can be followed on Twitter at BradPower7. And Brad, Payne and I kicked off the show kind of highlighting some of the things that we saw last week, and always want to give you the opportunity if there's something that stood out to you in a positive or negative fashion during college football week 3.
I will not be backing interim coaches with that one-game bump probably anytime soon. So for everyone out there listening, don't expect to hear me preach about an Arizona State ticket this week without good old Herm Edwards. That Nebraska-Oklahoma game wasn't fun by any stretch of the imagination.
How about that, Herm Edwards? Payne, we didn't talk about that at the top. I mean, we've seen head coaches get fired on the tarmac. I think that might go down as the first head coach to get fired on the field. Didn't even have a chance to go back to the locker room and talk to his players after the game when you lose outright as a 20-point favorite against Eastern Michigan.
Should have been fired long ago. That wasn't quick enough. I'm shocked he was still there, but obviously that was the tipping point, and good riddance. Now there's been some speculation that Mike Norvell could be in line for that job. It would seem like a step back, but who knows? Those are the guys. They'd also mentioned Adam Fuller, Florida State's defensive coordinator, and I got to tell you, that would be addition by subtraction. So hopefully Adam Fuller lands that job.
Well, it's good to know then that you're willing to go into your pocket, pay the moving expenses, help him pack his bags if Arizona State wants to lure for Adam Fuller there. Clearly a program that's underachieved in Tempe, and I know a strong position taken by professional bettors early on when that win total came out significantly higher, so you have to be liking where you're sitting at this current juncture. But all right, boys, we have 6 games, or 6+ I should say, games to cover. Let's get right into it, and we'll go to the Big House first and foremost with an early kickoff at noon Eastern, where Michigan will welcome in the Maryland Terrapins. You're looking at Michigan right now as 16.5 point favorite. Total on this game is up substantially from the opener. That was as low as 59.5. We're now staring at 65.5. When you look at the Wolverines, they lead the FBS in points per game at 53.3. Point differential plus 149. First time scoring 50-plus points in 3 straight games since 1903. I don't think any of us were alive back then. Second highest differential through the first 3 games since 1936. But Brad, all of this comes against the Sisters of the Poor, glorified high school programs, and the worst strength of schedule in the country. How difficult when you do this is it to try and assess a team like Michigan that, yes, they've looked dominant on the scoreboard, but haven't been tested at all through their first 3 games?
It's a really good question, and shame on Michigan for scheduling those 3 tomato cans that they've faced so far. With that being said, you can only play the teams on your schedule, and you can only go out there and do what you're supposed to do, and Michigan did that in all 3 of those games. They were supposed to crush those 3 teams, and they went out and crushed those 3 teams, and especially in so far this season where we've seen multiple 14, 21-plus point underdogs win outright in college football. The fact that they were able to do what they're supposed to do, I think it gives them, a little bit of optimism. I think the big thing that gives Michigan optimism is the upside of J.J. McCarthy at quarterback, who looks like absolutely the future, not only because of his play here the last couple of games, but also with the injury to Cade McNamara. So I'm not down on Michigan. I'm not questioning them, really. I know this will be the first game that they're going to get a little bit of resistance and punchback, but, I think they're clearly a top 5 team in the country.
You look at this Wolverines team, and we talked about it on the Big Ten preview. We thought it could be a lot more offensive-minded football that we were going to see out of Ann Arbor when the defense had some questions. Not easy to replace the likes of David Ajabo and Aiden Hutchinson. Clearly, that defense will get tested in this spot, but you mentioned J.J. McCarthy, Brad, and while you hate to see Cade McNamara get shelled for a little while, I do wonder in that Michigan coaching room if they go, this is the chance J.J. needed, has nobody looking over his shoulder with an opportunity to assert himself as a true number 1. Payne, when you look at this Wolverines offense, obviously tough to try and extrapolate too much from the metrics. What have you seen over the first couple of games? To Brad's point, yes, they've played bad opponents, but they haven't left a shadow of a doubt about how explosive this team can be and how physical they are running the football behind Blake Corum and his touchdown outburst.
I think that's one thing that was perfectly depicted by Brad, because you listen to Blake Corum this week, and he's like, I'm not sure what we are or how good we can be based upon who we've played. We're excited about Michigan's offense, and we were heading into the season. You mentioned our preview podcast there. I think it's addition by subtraction with Josh Gaddis gone. You're also looking at the Wolverines O-line, projected to be one of the Big Ten's elite units. So far, they've been damn good. The weapons are probably the best Harbaugh's had during the Michigan era. The only question I had coming into the year, would the offense lose some of its physicality without Haskins, who moved on to the NFL? We saw what Haskins was to this offense. He was a mauler. He single-handedly won Michigan 2 or 3 games last season, but we thought the explosiveness would increase this season. So far, it has. It's been really good on the ground and through the air. J.J. McCarthy, you guys mentioned, took over at quarterback. 5-star kid, can wing it. He's got mobility. On 43 snaps so far this season, he has 0 negatively graded plays. The one area where Michigan struggled a touch is late downs. Likely some variance, checking in at 130th in the country there. But when you've played defenses like Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn, it does make me a little bit nervous. Those 4 heading into this week have an average schedule-adjusted defensive efficiency rank of 119th. So variance or not on third down, that can't be the type of performance against that caliber of competition. Now, I've actually been a little surprised by Maryland's defense. They're playing better than our preseason projections. I think we had the Terps pegged somewhere in the range of like the mid-70s for schedule-adjusted defensive efficiency coming into the season. They're playing like a defense in the mid to high 50s right now, and once you parse through the fact that a lot of depth guys played early against Charlotte and Buffalo, and that was by design if you listen to Loxley about not wanting to expend his starters in those games. Then against a damn good SMU offense, the Terps held the Mustangs to below the national average in yards per play, success rate, explosive play rate, points per drive. That was damn impressive to me. But I think the one thing that I think about with this game in general is just variance. And I tried making a case for Maryland here, but they have just crapped the bed under Loxley any time they've stepped up in class. If you look since Loxley arrived in 2019, Maryland's played 9 games against top 20 opponents. They're doing that again, obviously, this weekend. They've lost all 9 of those, and by a score of 465 to 112. Maryland hasn't covered any of those.
I think we were on
games.
one. I think we were on one of those games in College Park against Penn State. That game was over 2 drives in a couple of years ago.
We were. I went to drinks early on Friday evening because we took 6 in that game and they lost 53-0. Okay. But they haven't covered these 9 games by a combined 205 points. You think about that, right? Maryland hasn't covered those 9 games against top 20 teams by nearly 23 points per game. I need to watch. I need to see if this is real. I think I agree a little bit on the total. Brad, were you part of that over 59.5 on Sunday?
I wasn't. It's blown through my. I mean, I would have leaned that way, but it's kind of blown past my numbers at this point. What I did bet was, I was a little surprised. We're sitting here at 16.5. Open 17. I thought that was fair. Came down. I bet Michigan because of what you mentioned, Maryland in big time games not stepping up, and obviously Michigan a part of those games. I mean, Michigan's won 6 straight by 34 points per game in the series, covered them by 2 touchdowns per game. I haven't seen it yet from Maryland stepping up in these big games, performing anywhere close to this number.
Makes complete sense.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, you look at Mike Loxley and what he's been able to do. Clearly, recruiting is the strength of this football team. Offensively, they put up gaudy numbers when they punch down in class. We'll see, to both of your gentlemen's points, if they're able to try and do that when they step up here against the Michigan team. And clearly, the market has paid them a little bit of respect. When you go through Michigan's defense, they haven't been tested yet. They obviously will be this week by a trio of Maryland playmakers at minimum. When you look at Tagovailoa, nearly an 80% completion rate so far this season, a shade under 300 yards per game, 6 passing touchdowns to just 2 interceptions. But I think the bigger revelation, Brad, for this Maryland offense has been the emergence of Roman Hemby. I mean, he's averaged nearly a first down every time he's carrying the football. And last week, what blew me away against SMU, this looked to be a run-first Terrapins offense, and it allowed them to pay dividends late in that game when they tried to find some separation against the Mustangs.
Very surprising, because if you were coming into the season, the one thing I thought Maryland can really hang their hat on offensively, not only the pass game with Tagovailoa, but I mean, I thought Maryland legitimately had a top 20 wide receiver core, 3-4 legitimate guys, a couple of them former 5-star guys. So the fact that they've been able to find a running game, ran for north of 200 yards last week, led by Hemby. The fact that they're going to give me a little bit more balance says that, maybe they'll have success here against a Michigan defense. I think what you first said, though, not quite sure how good this Michigan defense is. They lost a lot of talent from last year's team, haven't played anybody yet. Watching the spring game, I thought they were going to be a little bit better than expected. I think the defensive line had some guys that are very capable of replacing what they lost, but they'll get their first test in this game. And the market is telling us that Maryland is going to have success offensively with the over and Maryland both getting money in the marketplace.
Payne, anything to be concerned about metrically when you look at the Terps offense through their first 3 games, wins against Buffalo, where we saw them take money. They were driven from 21 out to 24. They win that game 31-10. They obviously move the football with minimal resistance, as every team in college does, against the Charlotte 49ers defense. And then last week, we saw a true battle in the market, guys. That number opened 3. We saw SMU money ping-ponging between 2.5 and 3. Maryland ultimately outlasted SMU 34-27, but wasn't sure if you saw any noise or reason for concern with what Maryland may want to do offensively this week.
I watched that game last week. I thought, Brad, you were on the right side, and to this point, Maryland certainly has the best data point of the 6 these teams have against SMU, and I thought Maryland was better than what the scoreboard indicated. Maryland was a net 1.8 yards per play better, positive 12% net and net success rate, and then 5% more explosive. So I liked what I saw from Maryland. Baby Tua, you mentioned, he's actually been the most accurate quarterback in the country this season. And then you mentioned, the run game. I think this is probably Loxley's best O-line during his tenure. They've created 3.1 line yards per rush thus far. Hemby, even Littleton showing a little bit of explosiveness there. There looks like there's finally some balance, and Maryland's offense is inside the top 40 in both EPA per rush and EPA per pass. The receiver group hasn't quite come on yet. I know Copeland transferred in. You have Dante Dumas still working his way back from a nasty injury, so hopefully those guys can pick it up a little bit. But here's what my eyes and the data suggests here, Todd. Maryland's offense has been a little Jekyll and Hyde. When it's in rhythm, they can really move the ball. But Maryland routinely bogs down. There's a lot of stupid penalties. They don't have a ton of quality possessions yet. Even against SMU, 39% of Maryland's drives were 3 and out. Maryland doesn't bypass third down on early downs enough. And when they get to third down, they haven't been great there. Brad laid Michigan early, got ahead of the 3 scores. I don't want to side right now in this game. It just, again, feels like there's a ton of variance for both teams. Brad mentioned Michigan's defense looking better in the spring game. Let's see here. You lose a defensive coordinator. You lose 8 starters. We fully expected regression coming into the season. And then you have your projected starting middle linebacker, Hill Green, hasn't played yet this season. Michigan survived early, and we said they would survive early based upon the schedule. I mean, again, Colorado State, UConn, Akron, on average, those 3 offenses rank 123rd in schedule-adjusted efficiency so far. I'm not sure what Michigan's defense is. And again, the market is alluding to some points here, although, there's been some funky stuff early this week with totals.
Let me tell you, Maryland has fooled me before. Payne, you highlighted it. I joked about the game against Penn State. Last year against Iowa, when Talia was being talked about as a dark horse Heisman candidate, we saw those things come crashing down. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And that's kind of been Maryland when they step up in class after going through the non-conference portion of the schedule. But maybe SMU, that win there is a harbinger of things to come. We'll find out Saturday at the Big House as both these teams will get tested in their conference opener. To the ACC we go, gentlemen. It's Clemson on the road in Winston-Salem take on the Wake Forest Demon Deacons, and Clemson enters the game as a touchdown favorite. Total in this contest sits at 55. A blackout expected in Winston-Salem for this one. It'll be the highest ranked matchup in the history of Truist Field. When you look at Wake, they helped end Clemson's run of dominance in the Atlantic Division last year, despite Clemson beating them outright and doing so in dominating fashion. Clemson has won 13 straight in the series, and when you look at Clemson, they've been dominant within its own division. The Tigers have won 39 of 41 against Atlantic Division rivals since a 6-point loss at number 1 Florida State way back in 2014. The only losses in that span came last year at NC State and in 2017 at Syracuse, a game on Friday night. When you look at Wake Forest, 0-24 this century against top 10 opponents and have just 1 top 10 win all time. That came way back in October of 1946 against Tennessee. I'm sure a game that all of us and our listeners remember quite vividly. When you look at this Clemson offense, we knew that there were going to be major concerns, Brad, coming into the year. 13-6 at the half last week against Louisiana Tech. They look pretty apathetic in their opener against Georgia Tech. Have we seen enough from the Tigers offense to show that they're going to be able to provide some of that big play potential to go with a defense that a lot of us expected to be inside the top 10 for sure and potentially inside the top 5 if things broke the right way?
Not yet. I will say there are some signs of improvement. Not saying much considering how bad Clemson was offensively a year ago, but a couple of things. DJ's been a little bit more accurate. Again, not saying much considering how much he struggled a year ago, but the touchdown interception ratio, much better than what it was a year ago. One thing that's helping him out a little bit, he's running more, which I thought would be the case. The fact that he trimmed down, lost about 30 pounds in the offseason, the fact that they can run him more because they have a legitimate backup quarterback, unlike last season. So that's helped him out a little bit, but the fact is they played 3 tomato cans. There's been some inefficiency there and some inconsistency. So ask me after probably next week after they face a legitimate defense in NC State. I'm not sure that they're facing a true legitimate Wake Forest defense that just got lit up here last week against Liberty. Liberty team playing with a backup quarterback. So I expect Clemson's offense just like even last year when they had that, one of their worst offenses in recent memory, still were able to put up 48 points on the board against Wake. So I think Clemson will be just fine offensively in this one.
I always have to be careful, Brad, when I sell Dave Clawson's stock. I mean, he is on my Mount Rushmore of man crushes in college football, right up there with Jonathan Smith and what he's been able to accomplish in Corvallis. Always have a tremendous amount of respect for coaches that do it at programs that aren't traditional powers. Payne, when you look into this game and you're trying to identify a single factor with where you think the football game will ultimately be decided, I know you are the torchbearer, the ringleader, the president of the Sam Hartman fan club when you split allegiances and alliances diverging from Stetson Bennett. Does he have enough around him in this game to put a little bit of fear into a Clemson defense? Because you dig into the numbers, and Brad referenced it last week against Liberty. I mean, Wake Forest got absolutely nothing from their running backs, and with a slow mesh point against this Clemson defensive front, Sam Hartman could need to do a lot to extend plays often.
Yeah, that's obviously the big question here. You have this, unique slow mesh offense with Sam Hartman, and he's been awesome running it the last few years, but I'm not in love with what I'm seeing. And I think that has to change for Wake Forest to have a chance at keeping it close against Clemson, because I don't have any faith in Wake Forest defense. But what's a little surprising to me is Wake Forest's offensive line. They're returning over 100 starts this season. And between VMI, Vandy, and Liberty, the Wake Forest offensive line has just been not very good, and about 50th percentile in adjusted line yards. Ellison and Turner haven't been good in the backfield. Sam Hartman really hasn't shown a willingness to run since his return from surgery. Just 8 non-sack runs in 2 games. All told, Wake Forest right now 128th in rushing success rate, 116th in EPA per rush. Last week, Liberty bullied the shit out of Wake Forest's offensive line. It was nuts watching it because I didn't believe the numbers I had in front of me. I literally had to go find the game on YouTube to watch it. 54% of runs were stuffed, just an 18% rushing success rate. Wake Forest averaged 0.4 yards before first contact per rush. Now you get a Clemson defensive line. That's the best in the country. Brian Brees returned to practice Tuesday. I know the defense is going to rally around him after the loss of his sister. All signs point to both Tyler Davis and Xavier Thomas playing. Clemson has, I think the premier defensive line in the country, and they've really done a nice job figuring out Wake's offense the last few matchups. Clemson's defense, to me, right now, top 7 in schedule adjusted run defense. My feeling is there's going to be a lot of negative plays for Wake's offense. Hartman could be under pressure more than usual. If you look at Hartman, he's really struggled under pressure. Very small sample, but just 8 total yards passing and an adjusted accuracy rate of 37% so far this season with the heat on. He's got the lowest QBR under pressure. I can see why this opened 6.5 a few places, and now we're trending through that key to 7.5.
You mentioned the return of Brian Brees, and of course, some things obviously are bigger than football. So you want to tip your hat to Sonny Cumbie and the nice gesture that we saw from Louisiana Tech. Had all of his players write a letter. Of course, Brees lost his sister, 15 years old, to brain cancer. I know the Clemson team was actually headed up to Maryland for the team funeral. I think at last check, there were about 40 or 50 teammates. So you hate to see those kind of things, much more important than wins and losses. As far as Clemson defensively, while they are getting some players back, one thing you're going to want to monitor, the health and status of some key contributors in their secondary. Nate Wiggins and Andrew Makuba were listed as unavailable for the game last weekend. Sheridan Jones left early. Now, Clemson, if they can dominate in the trenches, it may not matter what they have in the back end, but clearly you want your full complement of defensive stalwarts against this Wake offense. Last but not least, Brad, I want to bounce it back to you. When you look at the way Clemson has been priced through the early going, of course, they weren't able to get outside the number last week against Louisiana Tech as nearly 5 touchdown favorites, winning that game 48-20. Do you feel the market has priced the Tigers the right way? Why I think all of us sit and watch this team with bated breath, figuring out what they're going to be offensively?
I'm not sure yet because of the inconsistency we've seen from Clemson so far. I mean, if you watch the early portions of the Georgia Tech game, you're like, oh, I bet Clemson in the game and got in front of a big line move, and I didn't think I had any chance of cashing a ticket, and they ran Georgia Tech out in the final 20 minutes of the game. They get outgained by an FCS team against Furman, so that was a bad data point. We saw a couple of sharp betting guys fade Clemson last week. But with that being said, I'm a little surprised at how low this was priced. I thought the market wasn't giving Clemson enough respect in this particular matchup. So I got him as number 5 in the country. They are behind the two Big Ten teams, Ohio State and Michigan, and obviously Alabama and Georgia out of the SEC. The next 2 data points, we will find out if Clemson is back to being a legitimate playoff team like they were for so many years, or if they're closer still to last year's team that disappointed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that both of you guys brought up. But we may think we know something about Clemson. We'll know a hell of a lot more after the next 2 Saturdays when they take on Wake Forest and have a revenge date against NC State. From the ACC, though, gentlemen, we'll head over to the Big Ten, a night game in Columbus where Ohio State sees themselves as more than 2 touchdown favorites. That number 18.5 with the Wisconsin Badgers coming to town. Total on this game at 57. When you look at the Buckeyes, they've won 8 straight games over the Badgers. Wisconsin has been double-digit underdogs for just the 3rd time since 2019, or this Saturday will mark that. The first 2 games, they're 0-2 straight up, both coming against the Buckeyes. Those 2 games did come in under the total as well, and always a little bit unusual when you see an Ohio State total posted in the 50s. This will be the 2nd time in 4 weeks we have that scenario play out. We know how week 1 ended against the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. When you look at Wisconsin, they come into this contest off a 66-7 thrashing of New Mexico State. I'm here to tell you that I'm not buying the Graham Mertz hype train that suddenly Wisconsin has figured things out with their passing attack, beating up on inferior opponents, because all you have to do is go back a previous week and they were ill-equipped to come back against the juggernaut known as the Washington State Cougars. When we look at these 2 teams, I think we have one good data point for both. Neither one of them exceeded odds makers' expectations. The Buckeyes workmanlike in the season opener against Notre Dame. Wisconsin loses outright as a 17-point favorite. Brad, with these 2 teams in regard to their power rating, what have you done through the first couple weeks of the season as it pertains to Wisconsin and Ohio State's full body of work?
I have Wisconsin down, obviously, for the performance of them obviously coming up short against Washington State. Looked like the same Wisconsin from the last few years offensively. So downgrade Wisconsin. I'm actually now up to where I had the Buckeyes at the start of the preseason as far as the power rating. I thought last week's data point, I know it's against Toledo. I know the Rockets are a MAC team. But what I saw offensively from Ohio State last week is what my expectation was coming into the season. That is, Ohio State has the best offense in the country. So that brought them up a little bit to the point where now, I mean, with the improvements I have seen defensively from Ohio State compared to last year, and now that it looks like they're getting healthier at the wide receiver position, I mean, I think the Buckeyes, along with Georgia and Alabama, right now are the only threats, the real threats to win the national championship.
And you mentioned Ohio State and what they were able to do. Of course, they blasted Toledo 77-21 to improve to 51-0-1 against teams from the state of Ohio since they lost to the college football juggernaut known as Oberlin College way back in 1921. A fine liberal arts school, but one not known for its football prowess, let's put it that way. It matched their 21st century scoring record, the 3rd time the Buckeyes have scored exactly 77 points since 2016, and they came within 13 yards of their 21st century yardage record. Why is that relevant? Because it came against Brad's alma mater back in 2016 when they racked up 776 yards against the Bowling Green Falcons. Payne, normally a lot of people will look at the Ohio State offense and try and figure out if the Badgers have a snowball's chance in hell to stop them. But I almost want to flip the script unless you feel otherwise. When you look at this game, is it about Ohio State's offense against Wisconsin's defense? Is it more on the other side, figuring that out if the Badgers can put together drives, keep Jim Knowles' defense off balance, and stay comfortably inside the number if they're to be a live underdog on Saturday?
It's possible Wisconsin's offense is incrementally better than last season. And Graham Mertz has looked more comfortable through 3 games, 81% adjusted accuracy, and a 12.1 yards per attempt from a clean pocket. But I think you hit it perfectly in that when they had to play catch-up, the offense still looked the same. Wisconsin is 3-0 in the advanced box score, but had issues scoring, against Washington State when they move the ball down the field. Just some bad green zone offense there. But I think when we look at the improvements that Ohio State's made, a lot of that comes on the defensive side of the ball with Jim Knowles. So I think you're probably at a wash there. And ultimately, I think the key factor to this game is where it's supposed to be good on good. I think that's the belief. I love Jim Leonard. Shocked he hasn't taken some of the jobs that he's been offered. But we have to think about this. Leonard's replacing 8 defensive starters from a defense that allowed 31% of plays to grade successful last season and was top 5 in schedule adjusted EPA per play. I think Wisconsin's defense might appear close to previous iterations because of the schedule of offenses outside of Ohio State aren't great on this schedule. But this is the spot where I think we see a little bit of the truth. Wisconsin's played 3 offenses so far that have an average schedule adjusted efficiency of 124th. And so far, the Badgers haven't been great stopping first downs on early downs. And I think we knew coming into the season, when you look at this matchup and you look at how Wisconsin's built, Jim Leonard had to bring in 4 defensive back transfers. The guy he handpicked to play safety was Travion Blaylock, tore his ACL in spring. Ohio State, as Brad mentioned, has their full complement of pass catchers back and healthy this week. You also look at the styles. We know Jim Leonard loves to play an attacking style, send blitzes, and that's, outside he likes to play press man. The secondary worries me a bit. You hate to change your style defensively, but that's probably not the best approach with the Notre Dame data point where we saw Freeman come out in this too high shell look and give CJ Stroud some trouble. And that might be what we get here. I think that's probably the better approach. And you look at some of the numbers that might indicate that's the way Jim Leonard chooses to attack this. I understand Illinois State, Washington State, and New Mexico don't really require you to do much defensively, but sometimes a coach will tell you what he thinks about his unit by the game plan and the play calling. Leonard, as I mentioned, is typically an aggressive guy that likes to blitz, routinely in the high 30% range of blitz rate. He sent 15 blitzes in 3 games, 17% blitz rate so far in the season, yet his secondary is still giving up some explosive passes. It tells me Leonard might not be confident leaving transfers on islands early in the season when they're all still working out on chemistry. These aren't questions that you want heading into the shoe against, Ryan Day, CJ Stroud, and Smith and Jigba and that cast of weapons. So I think that's the interesting game within the game here is what does Jim Leonard elect to do? You have the great data point with Notre Dame's defense, but that's typically not his style of defense. Let's see what he comes out in.
Yeah, I mean, Wisconsin made a big deal this offseason about bringing in Jay Shaw, the transfer from UCLA. We know they'll start a redshirt freshman opposite side him and Ricardo Hallman. And clearly the headliner, as we've seen so many years in the past, Wisconsin is at the linebacker position. It's all about Nick Herbig and his ability to provide a little bit of pressure, get CJ Stroud off his spot. Meanwhile, on the other side, I know we touched on it briefly, but Brad, I'll come back to you. When you look at this Wisconsin offense, and Braylon Allen clearly going to be the next in a long lineage of great Wisconsin running backs that has the potential to join the likes of, a Melvin Gordon, James White, Monty Ball, Anthony Davis, Ron Dane, etc. that goes through, and of course, Jonathan Taylor most recently. Do you think Wisconsin will be able to have any success running the ball, or is this more about Mertz using the pass to set up the run, knowing how stubborn Paul Chryst can be in these games?
If it was Ohio State's defense the last couple of years, I would have said yes. I expect Allen to have his way, but I know it's early yet. Ohio State's only given up 84 rushing yards per game. I mean, that's the best in 15 years for the Buckeyes. So it has been much improved under Jim Knowles, and I got to think that the game plan for the Buckeyes is to stack the line of scrimmage, make Graham Mertz, force him to beat you. Even though Mertz looks like he's improved so far this season, again, the competition hasn't been that stiff. So I expected the Buckeyes to put an extra guy or two in the box, try to shut down Allen, which I think they can, and it's going to ultimately come down to Mertz and his ability or inability to make some plays in the passing game if they're going to keep this game close.
Yeah, I mean, I love to believe in Wisconsin that they finally turn the page and join the rest of college football in the 21st century, but until I see Graham Mertz go out there and win a game, or I should say in this case, at least keep a game competitive with his arm. Call me skeptical in that regard. What I was blown away by, guys, to try and put in a historical context, through 3 games, Wisconsin's averaging more than 260 yards per game through the air. That would blow away all the school records. You want to talk about a program who lives up to its stereotype? Russell Wilson holds the single-season record for passing yards per game back in 2011, 234.3 yards per game. Little to say, Mike Leach offenses do that typically in a half. So let's see what Wisconsin can do if they're able to keep it competitive against the Buckeyes, knowing how high a regard we hold them in for sure. From the Big Ten, boys, we head to the SEC, where it's the Florida Gators on the road in Knoxville to take on the Tennessee Volunteers. And this number has some historical significance. So, Brad, I want you to put it in context in just a second. Tennessee, a 10.5-point home favorite. Total in this game is 62.5. We can officially say the bloom is off the rose for the Florida Gators. They, of course, upset Utah week 1. They follow it up with a lame duck performance against Kentucky and arguably hit rock bottom, at least we think, last week against South Florida, where they have to outlast an in-state rival despite being a 3+ touchdown favorite in that spot. Florida has dominated this series, winning 16 of the last 17. Tennessee's lone win in that span came back in 2016. 2 of the last 3 times, Tennessee was the higher-ranked team. It hasn't mattered when you look at how this thing has played out. And during that span, Florida is 11-6 against the spread over those 17. The Gators have been a favorite of 13 or more in each of the last 3 games, outscoring Tennessee by nearly 20 points per game over the last 5 matchups. But the reason I wanted historical context, Brad, you had a great nugget on what your data suggests and how rare this particular number is, with Tennessee installed as a favorite in that 10.5 range.
Yeah, so my records go back to 1976. I don't think Payne or myself were alive back then. I think, Todd, you were, sitting there, freshman or sophomore in high school. But
yeah, it was about the time I was getting bar mitzvah, so I'm good.
There you go.
L'chaim.
So even going back, 45 plus years, Tennessee in this series has never been favored by even more than a touchdown. So a very historical line here that I think says not necessarily that, Tennessee's back to what they were in the 90s with Peyton Manning and T. Martin, but more of where Florida's at. And shocking considering what Florida did in week 1 against Utah just a couple weeks later, catching double digits in this game.
Yeah, I mean, this is a Gators team right now that have yet to score a single point in the third quarter this season, so I have no idea what kind of adjustments Billy Napier and his staff are making at halftime. They've accumulated just 10 plays of 20-plus yards to start the season. That's actually tied for the fewest in the SEC with South Carolina. That does come with a caveat, as Florida has had one of the more difficult schedules in all of FBS, in my opinion, through the first 3 weeks amongst Power 5 programs. But Payne, in the wake of that win against Utah, you highlighted some of the major concerns about Anthony Richardson. They have come true and then some over the last 2 games. And an interesting quote from Richardson, along with the coaching staff this week, said he hasn't been able to impose his will physically because there's legitimate concerns in that quarterback room until they get Jack Miller healthy, that Richardson has to be smart and keep himself in one piece more so than being that downfield running threat.
Well, first of all, Brad didn't get the memo. You're not allowed to mention T. Martin on this podcast for obvious reasons.
I thought your disdain would be more for
Florida's,
your buddy, the Red Rooster, there.
Maybe. To this point, Florida's offense has been extremely one-dimensional. And to me, when I look at these 2 units, Florida's offense and Tennessee's defense are moving in opposite directions. And sure, Billy Napier came out and kind of, tricked, disguised, and motioned his offense to a win against Utah when nobody knew what to expect. But now that there's film, it's been pretty ugly. And we all sat here and kind of diagnosed Anthony Richardson's shortcomings, I think, long before the college football world wanted to recognize them. And it's actually been worse than I envisioned. It's worse than what we projected heading into, some of these games that we've broken down. Through 3 games, Anthony Richardson has a 36% depth adjusted accuracy rate. 32% of Richardson's passes have been deemed uncatchable. 50% of them have been accurate based on ball placement. He's got a 12% interceptable pass rate to just a 5% explosive pass rate. Absolute bottom of the barrel among 137 qualifying quarterbacks. Anthony Richardson's graded out the 134th best passer. And the motion that Billy Napier is using to kind of help Anthony Richardson identify what the defense is going to do pre-snap, its effectiveness seems to kind of be diminishing as all these defenses catch on. And because Anthony Richardson hasn't been accurate, Napier doesn't really trust him to throw to all parts of the field. And you can see that even against USF, only 11% of the attempts that Richardson threw were between the hashes past the line of scrimmage. Two of them. So he's just very limited right now. I think the questions we had about Florida's receiver group has come full circle. You're seeing a lot of 2 tight end sets pretty frequently. They've delivered horrible efficiency numbers through the air, but the heavy formations have helped the Gators run the ball. Back-to-back games, you're kind of seeing this unfold a little bit, right? Kentucky held Florida to a 24% passing success rate. Crappy spot last week for sure, but Florida won by 3 at home against USF as a 24-point favorite. Had to do it with a defensive score and 3 USF turnovers. Tennessee's defense, to me, has been a little bit of a pleasant surprise. I think we know Florida wants to run through 3 games, the Vols are number 2 in EPA per rush allowed. They've stuffed 29% of runs. Opposing teams have a negative EPA per rush. And I understand 2 of the 3 offenses the Vols faced are Akron and Ball State. But even against a veteran offensive line on the road at Pittsburgh, when its offense wasn't humming, Pitt averaged 0.4 yards per rush before first contact. The Vols defense really held strong in that game. I was surprised to see that. I do want to see what Tim Banks decides to do defensively, because he's a guy that usually plays high rates of man and likes to blitz. Against Pittsburgh, though, Tennessee played just 15% of zone snaps. We know what Anthony Richardson is. We talked about this in our Kentucky breakdown. You want to make Richardson read and pass accurately into zone windows. You want to keep your eyes on him so you can see when he takes off. Now, there have been some coverage busts if you're willing to play too aggressively. So I think what you want to see here is Tim Banks change some things up, play a little bit more zone than they've showed so far this season. And I think if you do that, the Gators' offensive woes are going to continue, especially in a hostile environment. I mean, first road game of the season. I think that's big. Now, I understand if you look at some of the metrics, you're probably thinking Tennessee's going to show some third down regression, some red zone defensive regression. That's probably coming. But is Anthony Richardson and the Gators receiver group the combination that's going to exploit some of these Vols inefficiencies on defense? Are they going to be able to push the ball downfield and attack a secondary that's given up some explosive plays? I don't really know, right? I mean, the Gators right now, 122nd in explosive passing. There's also some whispers here, and I don't know if you guys have heard, but Richardson's dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury that is, that he's not 100% right now is what I'm hearing.
Well, the ankle injury would be news to me because, I mean, I had heard that surgically repaired knee was causing problems, and a lot of the Florida beat writers said when he took a hit to that knee in the first quarter of the Kentucky game, he hasn't looked right since, and some of the numbers suggest that he's obviously accumulated just 28 yards rushing over the last 2 games, 4 interceptions, and to kind of put things in perspective where Anthony Richardson is, Payne, in addition to some of those efficiency numbers, Richardson is one of 4 players in the country that has not thrown a touchdown pass this season, not exactly becoming of a guy that was 16-1 to win the Heisman Trophy after the Utah game, but has at least 4 interceptions. He joined such exclusive company as Jerry Bohannon at USF, Hawaii's Braden Shager, and a household name that everybody knows in Las Cruces in New Mexico State, Diego Pavia. So clearly Richardson needs to get a little bit more in the passing game if Florida is going to create some of that balance. But for this Tennessee team, Brad, we know defense is an afterthought for what Josh Heupel and Alex Golesh want to do offensively. They could be a little bit limited in the receiving room this week, down one of their key cogs, but at the same time, Hendon Hooker has shown a willingness and an ability to spread the ball around, and they should get a little bump in the backfield with the healthy tandem of running backs.
Yeah, so I mean, it's mainly been par for the course for Tennessee offensively. We expected them to be a top 10 team on that side of the ball. So far, so good. Although I will say, I think a lot of it's boosted up by a couple of terrible MAC teams in Ball State and Akron. I was actually really disappointed with Tennessee offensively in the Pittsburgh game. I thought they'd have much more success against that Pittsburgh, coverage style than what they ended up doing. So I think that the jury's still out a little bit for Tennessee and how good they can be on that side of the ball. But with that being said, I mean, I do think there'll be some opportunities for Tennessee actually in the ground game for this one. I mean, look no further than last week's Florida defense, allowing 286 rushing yards and 6.2 yards per carry against a South Florida rush offense that wasn't wowing me, at least in their first couple of games. Also, Florida can't get pressure on the quarterback, only 3 total sacks so far this season. So I do expect Tennessee to have their way offensively, although I think we're going to see a lot more of the ground game than usual.
Which would make a ton of sense, knowing that when you look at the Vols last week, they were able to give Jalen Wright the lion's share of the carries, 23 totes in total. Jabari Small went down with a minor injury in the first drive, but returned as a full participant to practice on Tuesday after that upper body injury. Payne, Brad mentioned Florida's defensive concerns, and they clearly look soft up the middle. They've talked about it being an absence of their team defensive leader in Ventrell Miller. Can any of these things be rectified, given what USF did as a one-dimensional offense? offense. They told you they were running. They were able to do it. Obviously, you got to cover sideline to sideline against this Vols attack.
You read that too. Just communication issues. That's all that's going on here.
Not an absence of talent or athletes or anything along those lines. Communication. But you know what? Hold on one second. The NFL, that's all the Cleveland Browns attributed their collapse to the Jets too with their defensive back. So maybe it's an endemic across all of college and pro football at this point. Communication being key.
Florida's defense has some nice pieces, but it's very much this incomplete puzzle, right? There's guys that have been moved around. There's young guys with talent. There's old guys coming back for fifth seasons because they weren't good enough to move on to the next level. It's a very thin defensive line, especially on the interior. And I think the thin defensive line, especially in the middle, continues to be a point of emphasis for us to drive home, and Brad hit it perfectly. Javon Dexter is really the only SEC caliber player in his current form that's on the interior of that defensive line. And I just wonder what this looks like against a bona fide SEC opponent. And you think about this Josh Heupel offense. They're all about tempo. They're all about pace. Tennessee ran 3.1 plays per minute last season, most in the country. They're mirroring that pace again this season. How does Florida's defensive front handle tempo for 60 minutes? That thing to me, this matchup is why this line might be a little bit higher than people think. And I think, we were one of the first to identify this problem in the offseason. And again, just look to what coaches are telling you. They were dying for interior defensive line help and struck out like 3 times in recruiting battles. We now have the data points to help us confirm those suspicions. Through 3 games, Florida's stuffed 12% of runs. They're giving up more than 3.5 line yards per rush and a positive 0.28 EPA per rush. That's outside the top 100 in college football. Just last week, Brad mentioned it, more than 52% of USF's runs gained 5 or more yards, and they're not really a threat to throw the forward pass with Gary Bohannon. So that was really concerning to me. You mentioned Ventrell Miller. There was some good signs. There was a picture that surfaced of him on a treadmill this week, didn't have a walking boot on, so let's see if he gets out there and plays. He's obviously vital to the communication for Florida's defense. But what's interesting to me is there's a possibility that the Gators' defense is worse than we actually think. Right now, Florida's 52nd in defensive adjusted efficiency, but more than 65% of opponent possessions have been deemed quality possessions. Florida's only given up 3.5 points per possession once opponents enter their green zone. If the green zone points allowed start to normalize and the quality possession rate stay the same, there's going to be more points inevitably on the scoreboard, right? 5 of USF's 10 drives entered the Gators' red zone last week. So I think the defense might actually be worse than we all think it is. Tennessee, to me, is a little bit of a different animal from what they've faced so far. They're very multiple on offense. They can do it through the ground, through the air. You have a mobile quarterback pulling the strings. And even though we've been able to identify it in the metrics, I think this could be a spot where Florida's defensive issues finally show themselves in a really major way. Now, the Gators, may luck out. You kind of hinted at the top, Todd. Cedric Tillman dealing with a high ankle sprain. He's averaging 3 yards per route run. He's the Vols' #1 receiver. It is a deep receiver core. You have some guys like Jalen Hyatt. Brew McCoy was finally granted eligibility. But I think Jabari Small, being healthy, went through a full practice on Tuesday. That's a really good sign. I think, Jabari Small is going to be the key to this game, running it with tempo up the middle, right at Florida where they're vulnerable. And ultimately, that's going to give Tennessee a big win here. Again, let's keep an eye on Cedric Tillman, but the beat writers as of, Wednesday morning that cover this team every day don't believe he's going to play.
Such an interesting dynamic because you see a role reversal, as Brad highlighted at the top. Tennessee not used to having a giant target on their back when they play one of their biggest rivals, and you can understand why when you're just 1-16 against them over the last 17 meetings. And clearly it takes a perfect storm of events, one team trending up, the other team trying to figure out its identity, to have a number this large. We'll see if Tennessee can handle the weight of expectations Saturday in Knoxville. You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. I'm Todd Furman. You, of course, can follow me there as well. You can follow Payne at Payne Insider. Most importantly, though, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And as we've always done, or started to do, I should say, this season with Brad jumping into the fold, we just don't give the big boys time under the bright lights. There's always an opportunity to do some deep diving and identify value in a non-Powers 5 group game. And this weekend, Brad, it takes us to a scene that was arguably the focal point of college football, given the way the game ended last week. That, of course, being Boone, North Carolina, where Appalachian State will see if they can continue to live that charmed existence. They welcome in FBS newcomer James Madison, and it's App State, widely available as a 7-point favorite. There is a couple of 7.5s out there. Total in this game, 58.5. And I guess, Brad, the first question I have for you as it pertains to the Dukes, how difficult is it to properly price a team that makes the jump from FCS power into the ranks of the FBS during their first season?
Well, I think that is the question in the game. I know we'll talk situation here in a minute, but I'm not sure the market or even guys like myself that power rate FBS and FCS teams really had a good handle on James Madison this year. I mean, it started with the end of last season. James Madison finished last season about 3 points better than an average FBS team. So really good. I mean, if you've been following along FCS, James Madison, the second best program to North Dakota State the last 5-6 years. The reason, the market downgraded James Madison, and I thought rightly so, at least at the time, was they lost a multiple-year starting quarterback. Their top wideout transferred to South Carolina. I watched South Carolina spring game. I thought he was South Carolina's best wideout in the game. So that's a big-time talent there. Their best defensive player transfers to Texas. So I thought there would be a big, talent disparity compared to what they were even a year ago. With that being said, obviously James Madison, comes in. Their first 2 games, 47 points. They've exceeded expectations as far as the point spread, starting with that game against Middle Tennessee, where they were short favorite and just blew out Middle Tennessee. And the beauty as we move along towards the season, you can kind of connect the dots as we collect some data points. The market treated Middle Tennessee harshly for losing to James Madison. I think a lot of people thought, Middle Tennessee must suck. They got blown out by James Madison, and we saw the market really react negatively to Middle Tennessee each of the last 2 weeks. What has Middle Tennessee done? They've covered the point spread their last 2 games after losing to James Madison by 52 points combined. So James Madison might be a lot better than what we anticipated this year. If that's the case, then, this number, it seems a little high. I know there's been some money, me included, on James Madison already, but this could be an instance where we just do not have a handle whatsoever on James Madison's power rating in week 3 of the season.
Yeah, Brad, a great point you brought up there, mentioning Middle Tennessee State, and we can highlight that Colorado State game week 2 specifically. We saw CSU open as a 5-point favorite, get bet up to nearly a 2-touchdown chalk at 14 before there was finally Blue Raiders money that showed. First score I saw in that game was 29-0 Middle Tennessee State. Now, obviously, that comes with a caveat as well, as we've seen Colorado State not exactly look like world beaters in Jay Norvell's first season, but to your point, the more data you have, the more dots you try and connect and figure out exactly what these teams are. Payne, real quick, and then Brad, I want you to follow up from Payne. When you look at a team like Appalachian State, you consider the 3 games they've gone through, came up 2 points short in one of the more entertaining games of the entire season against North Carolina, go on the road to College Station and beat Texas A&M 17-14 as 17.5, 18-point underdogs, and then last week they get a play from the heavens to erase a late 2-point deficit. We can call John Summerall out if we want. Ultimately didn't cost them. What does this team have left in the tank? There has to be a letdown, you would think, theoretically, after those ridiculous 3 games to kick off the campaign.
It's certainly tough to quantify situational spots, but we do know they exist, and typically they hinder younger 18, 19, 20-year-old kids more than grown adults, right? They're just inherently a little bit more emotional. But Brad's being candid. He got a better number than us. He took James Madison. We took James Madison on Monday at +8. We made the game 5. And this situational spot, right? How many weeks in a row can you get up? You were in a war against UNC. You go on the road, beat Texas A&M, and then you think, okay, no biggie. We got Troy on deck. But no, College game day comes to town. And so you have to get up again for that. Now all of a sudden you've competed against UNC. You upset A&M. You won on the final play against Troy. and you have a little bit of a target on your back. And so I think this is a really good spot for JMU, and it's a spot that we've invested in.
Brad, and lastly on this particular game, as Payne kind of alluded to, we know it's an imperfect science when it comes to trying to attribute a quantifiable value to a letdown spot. How do you go about that in some of your process? Now, don't peel back the curtain too far and reveal what the number adjustments may be, but when you look at some of these spots and try and figure out what kind of adjustments need to be made, how big a factor does that play into the overall handicap?
So it's an excellent question, and I think I'd have given you a different answer 5-6 years ago in my younger days as far as in this handicapping betting process. I probably looked at it too much, and I think Payne makes a great point. It's really tough to quantify, but he's right. They're out there, these situations, and sometimes I think they're worth more than a couple of points. And in this instance, I would make a case that this might be one of the better situational spots we've seen so far this young college football season. So can I put a specific number on it? No. But my gut instinct tells me this is something that could be worth several points in this particular game. So I did downgrade for this particular game App State a couple of points as far as my overall line on the game.
It's always so fascinating because, to your point, talking 5-6 years ago, and I'll go back even further when I started betting college basketball, situational spots honestly weren't even built into the number. Now I feel, at least in college basketball, there's an over adjustment made, and you can generate a little bit of value for yourself betting against some of those fade spots. College football a little bit different, and it's part of that process that you try and figure out where you think it's going to work in your favor. Can't just manufacture it. As last weekend we saw a number of teams that had pulled off double-digit outright upsets the previous week fall flat, and then on the counter example, you had a team like Washington State who showed no ill effects after beating Wisconsin outright as a 17-point dog, boat racing Colorado State. For every case study that's out there, you can make a case again, so I never like to make blind blanket generalizations when you're talking about handicapping football games. All right, from Boone, North Carolina to a very different environment out on the West Coast to Corvallis, a game that about 9 people will be able to watch on the Pac-12 network, but it doesn't take away the overall significance of what this football game can mean, not only in the national landscape, but the Pac-12 pecking order as well. Oregon State welcomes in USC, and we're looking at the Trojans right now as low as a 6-point favorite in some shots, upwards of 7 in others. Total in this game is up a touch from the opener. We're looking at 71, more or less, the consensus. And this series history has been really all one-way traffic. USC, 60-plus wins. They've only lost 12 times to the Beavers. The Trojans, meanwhile, have won 4 of the last 5 meetings, but they did lose in the Coliseum last year, 45-27 as 10-point favorites. It was actually the first time Oregon State had won in LA since 1960. Meanwhile, when you look at the Beavers, they've started the year 3-0 for the first time since 2014, which was the last season under Mike Riley. They have not started 4-0 since 2012, a year where they started 6-0. That was the last season where they ended the year ranked. They have, however, covered 8 straight games in Corvallis, and when you look at the Beavers as home underdogs, 5-2 straight up, 5-2 against the spread the last 7 times we've seen that. You have to go back to 2020, the last time they were in this role in the Civil War, civil conflict, whatever the hell they're calling it, when they take on Oregon annually. And for ranked USC teams, this has been a house of horrors to some extent. The Beavers beat number 3 USC 33-31 back in 2006. They beat number 1 USC 27-21 in 2008, and they followed that up beating number 20 USC 36-10 back in 2010. Of coaches hired before 2018, Jonathan Smith remains in an elite fraternity, as we've seen a lot of turnover there. Brad, when I look at USC early on, we know it's all gas, no brake from this Caleb Williams-led offense. We figured the defense could take time to gel, but in my opinion, last week's 42-17 win wasn't exactly indicative of how close that game could have been if Jake Haener doesn't go out in the first series of the second half.
Well, I think we could have said that for almost each of USC's first 3 games of the season, if not for 3 pick sixes against Rice. We saw Rice move the football in that game. We saw Stanford move the football, but yet turned it over inside USC's 5-yard line, not once but twice early in the game. I think that game's entirely different. I will say, even with Haener out, Fresno State still moved the football up and down the field with the backup, just had some red zone miscues. So I will say I was pretty pessimistic on USC, at least. Maybe not pessimistic is the right word, but more I didn't believe in USC as much as the market did, specifically futures market, season win totals and whatnot. I thought it'd be a much improved USC team, just not playoff contending Pac-12 championship USC team. Offensively, they have looked the part. All the transfers, for the most part, have worked out, starting with Caleb Williams at quarterback. Perfect fit for Riley's offense. You can tell there's familiarity there. Jordan Addison's been a great weapon. The former Biletnikoff winner has fit right into USC Lincoln Riley's system. But the problem is on the other side of the ball, and maybe it doesn't show up in common stats. You see, they're only giving up 20 points per game. It can't be too bad on the defensive side of the ball. I'm here to tell you, there's some major concerns with USC defensively, and I'm thinking it gets a little exposed this week.
It's interesting that you mention it, and I'll be honest here. I bet Fresno State in the second half, waited as long as I could against SC, took +3. Jake Haener goes down with that unfortunate injury, and you bring in a guy named Logan Fife. It may as well have been Barney Fife when it came to trying to generate points in the red zone for Fresno State. The bottom line was that the Bulldogs were able to move the football. They showed a little bit defensively in the latter portions of that first half, confusing Caleb Williams. But SC has been fast starters this year, Payne. They've scored 9 touchdowns on 11 first-half drives. Brad kind of talked about it a little bit. Turnover margin of +10. It's actually the best in college football. They're one of 5 teams with 0 turnovers so far this year. You combine that with 3 defensive and special teams touchdowns. It provides the perfect storm to try and run away and hide. I think so many people in this game, though, are going to want to talk about this UFC offense and what Caleb Williams, Jordan Addison, and their talented tandem of backs can do. There are some questions on the offensive line, but I'd rather flip the script and come to you to try and figure out what kind of optimism or maybe pessimism you may have for what Chance Nolan and this Oregon State Beavers attack will be able to accomplish against the USC defense that Brad said has showed plenty of vulnerabilities, even if it's not evident in the points per game allowed.
I think that's the big question here is, can Oregon State keep up a little bit? I know internally they don't think they've played their best ball, although Montana State last week, a very solid FCS defense that they showed out well against. But I think piggybacking on Brad's point here, this is just as much about USC's defense and the perception that isn't reality. The last 6 Fresno State drives reached the USC 44, 47, 32, 20, 15, and 1 yard line. A grand total of 7 points were scored on those 6 trips. 4 turnovers, a missed chip shot field goal, and just 1 touchdown. The last 4 Fresno drives went deep into USC territory and were with Fresno State's backup quarterback, who you mentioned, Logan Fife. He was a 2-star recruit as a player that's outside the top 3,300 in the 2020 recruiting class. Now, there's some talent on USC's defense. The secondary is the relative strong point. You have Tuatu Peloto and Corey Foreman. They've been solid up front. But as a whole, USC's defense continues to struggle everywhere but the scoreboard. USC's defense is getting by, I think, for 2 reasons, right? Turnovers, and its opponents are in predictable situations playing from behind because Caleb Williams and company have built leads. But if you look on standard downs, USC is allowing 53% of snaps to grade successful. USC's front 7 has gotten bullied for large stretches in the trenches. Just last week, Fresno won the early down battle. We know that has a more predictive element to it. Fresno just got slaughtered on late downs. 7.2 yards per rush for Fresno, 3.2 yards before a USC defender made first contact on Fresno State running plays. So that's something to look for here, obviously. USC's defense, through 3 games, they've allowed a positive 0.25 EPA per rush. That's 124th in the country. The Trojans have been, just beat up down to down on the ground. They've given up gashers. That's something Oregon State wants to see a little bit more of, the explosive run game. They haven't quite gotten that yet. Oregon State brought back 3 offensive linemen, and everything you hear from those guys is they want to be in vying contention for the Joe Moore Award. It's that or bust. Through 3 games, the Beavers O-line, they're moving some people around. 3.2 line yards per rush created, a positive 0.24 yards EPA per rush, rather. You have Fenwick. He's been, I think, a catalyst for the Beavers ground game. Doesn't quite have that explosiveness. We'll see if that comes on a little bit this week. But I think being able to run the ball is how Oregon State keeps this game competitive. Chance Nolan obviously has to be the guy to allow Oregon State to pull off the upset, because I think you can keep it close with just a good ground game, but if Chance Nolan plays his A-plus game, they might have a chance to pull this off. Wasn't good on the road at Fresno. If you look on drives where Oregon State's ground game gets them in 3rd and 5 type situations, Chance Nolan has to be able to extend those drives. And if they can do that, there's some potential here, right? There's question marks about the pass-catching core. Now one of your leaders and tight end Luke Musgrave is out for the foreseeable future. I think that's a pretty substantial loss. But the one thing here is familiarity. Jonathan Smith and Alex Grinch have squared off 3 times pretty recently. Jonathan Smith is obviously a Chris Peterson disciple, was with him at Washington as his OC. You have 3 Apple Cup games from 2015 through 2017. Washington and Jonathan Smith scored 41 or more against Grinch's Wazoo defenses in each of those 3 meetings. So I think when you listen to Lincoln Riley this week, his presser yesterday was quite telling. He was very concerned defensively. He thought Jonathan Smith was brilliant in the formations he uses and constantly changes them. And he talked a little bit about a defense that hasn't played a lot of snaps together. And I think that's going to be the interesting element here is can Jonathan Smith confuse a defense that really doesn't have a ton of cohesion yet?
The other part that's interesting, guys, and I'll open it up to either of you who want to answer. There's speculation amongst the Oregon State beat writers and, some of the wormholes I went down that Jonathan Smith hasn't exactly tipped his hand in terms of what this offense is truly going to look like. Didn't have to open up the playbook in week 1 against Boise State as they were able to force a couple of turnovers, built a comfortable lead. Against Fresno, it wasn't explosive or any outside-the-box thinking. They were fortunate to get the win, in my opinion, in a probable fashion. And then to your point, Payne, last weekend they draw a good FCS opponent, albeit Montana State down a number of running backs and key pieces. But what should have been a letdown, the Beavers go out there and score 68 points. We haven't seen a running back emerge yet, whether it's Fenwick or Martinez, to rival what B.J. Baylor gave them. But Brad, could this be the week that Jonathan Smith goes deep in the bag of tricks and suddenly they look a lot more like the teams we've grown accustomed to than what we've seen the first couple weeks of the season?
We certainly could. I just think you can, pretty much do whatever you want against this USC defense. I mean, I could say, I expect Jonathan Smith to go to the ground a little bit, but I also think he could have some success in through the airways. I will say one thing USC has done good defensively. They've gotten pressure on the quarterback with 14 sacks, but the bad news is Oregon State doesn't allow sacks. They've only given up 2 on 80 pass attempts so far this season. So I am not sure how he's going to attack USC's defense. One thing I do know is I expect success on that offense side of the ball. And we've talked a little bit earlier about some total manipulation in the market. Early numbers had, the Circa opened this up in the 70s. Early guys bet the under. I'm here to tell you, within 5-10 minutes after that, I bet the over. So I expect the Beavers to have their way offensively on the ground and through the air.
We do have to provide unbiased coverage here, gentlemen. And the way that we're laying this game out, people are going to go, man, I'm shocked that Oregon State isn't a 7-point favorite given all the defensive frailties you guys have highlighted for SC. Obviously, Lincoln Riley, no slouch when it comes to being an offensive mastermind. And when you look at this team so far this season, they're 4th in the nation in yards per play at a shade less than 8 per touch. Nearly 20% of their offensive snaps have graded out explosive. I mean, as far as accumulating offensive yards, more than 70% of the available yards USC has taken advantage of. Payne, metrically speaking, Oregon State, bend but don't break, hold to field goals. What becomes their best defensive approach to slowing down this Caleb Williams-led attack if he has all pieces working in harmony with one another?
This is the side of the ball that allows USC to be the favorite, obviously. There's star power here, right? Caleb Williams and Jordan Addison and Mario Williams, and then you have Lincoln Riley, a brilliant offensive mind pulling the strings. But the one thing that's made USC's offense so difficult to defend is they're balanced. And I think that's a relative surprise because to many, I looked at this a little bit, right? Like, I wasn't as down on USC's O-line. I know they don't have depth, but I thought some of their guys, based on some metrics, could move people in the trenches. You obviously got 2 premier transfer running backs through the portal. But the one thing that we should probably monitor is the O-line health, although it looks like Ford is back. He's going to be healthy to play here, but 109 career starts returned up front. And I do think USC struggles a little bit in protection still, but as run blockers specifically, USC's offensive line's been dominant. They're averaging 4 line yards per rush. That's number 1 in the country. Number 1 in opportunity rate. Only 10% of runs have been stuffed. That's second best. USC's O-line is getting to the second level, and I understand it's easier when teams have to worry about the pass. They're playing with lighter boxes, but Travis Dye and Austin Jones, they have feasted on the ground. 12th in rushing success rate, 0.41 EPA per rush through 3 games, and when I look at Oregon State's defense coming into the season, the relative strength was their secondary, their defensive backs. They returned a lot of production there. Now, the talent isn't close to what USC has outside, so let's see how that shakes out. But I am a little bit concerned about the Beavers' defensive front being able to stop some of the run game here, right? The front seven right now, 0.25 EPA per rush given up by Oregon State's defense through 3 games. So I think Oregon State has to be better stopping the run, and that's maybe a focal point that a lot of people don't think about when you see Caleb Williams and these receivers in this high-flying attack. And then you have to be able to get natural pressure on Caleb Williams. I know it's a difficult task, but that's the only way to kind of semi-survive on defense here. Now, Oregon State pressured Boise State on 42% of dropbacks, pressured Jake Haener and Fresno State on more than 39% of dropbacks. That's the key, right? Because I think, teams are deathly afraid of USC striking through the air, that, you don't really want to play your corners on islands, so teams aren't blitzing USC. But if you look at some of those metrics, right, USC's been blitzed on 22% of their dropbacks. It's the 96th highest rate in the country. It tells you that you have to get natural pressure. And even though teams aren't sending blitzes, Caleb Williams has been pressured on 30% of his dropbacks. So that's going to be the key here, is can Oregon State at least get a little natural pressure? 27% of the pressures on Caleb Williams have turned into sacks, so it is feasible. If Oregon State can get to Caleb Williams naturally, it can do a better job of defending the run and getting Caleb Williams in known passing situations. That's something to think about. USC's 117th in passing down sack rate allowed. So early downs, Oregon State has to be a little bit better stopping the run, have to get some natural pressure on Caleb Williams, and if you can do that, and then you get Chance Nolan on the other side, extending drives on 3rd and short, because I think those are the situations that Oregon State will be faced in offensively. Not only do you have a chance to cover, you might pull off the upset.
Final thing on this game, Brad, I'm putting the pressure on you. You're in Tim Tibesar's shoes, the defensive coordinator for Oregon State. You're sitting in the press box. When you're trying to devise a defensive game plan, better to be more aggressive, try and look for those turnover and momentum plays, or go, you know what, we're going to let SC run into a lighter box and play the bend but don't break, thinking that if we can hold them to field goals in the red zone, that has to be a win?
That's a good question. I think it's a combination of both. I think in the red zone, I play a little bit more conservatively, drop more guys in coverage. I think in early downs, I bring it a little bit. We've seen guys like Payne, said there incredibly well. They haven't been bringing pressure because of the fear of putting your corners on islands, and it hasn't worked out for anybody. So why not be a little bit differently in attacking this USC offense? I'd bring a little bit of heat.
Should be one hell of a game. These are the kind of chess matches you love to see, especially early on. There's no such thing as an easy road win in conference. Don't be fooled by the 48-28 scoreline that USC was able to put on Stanford at the Farm. 2 costly turnovers inside the 5 made that final score a lot more misleading. I'm not quite sure the trip to Reser Stadium will be as favorable. On to the final game, gentlemen, and it is 6 degrees of Lincoln Riley separation. So logically, it takes us to Norman, Oklahoma, where it's the Oklahoma Sooners playing host to the Kansas State Wildcats. Oklahoma, a 12-point favorite. Plenty of 13s out there as well. Total in this game, 53.5. And I guess the overarching question that I'll have for you guys, and I ask kind of rhetorically for now, what do we actually know about Oklahoma? They won the first 3 games of the season by 30-plus points for the first time since 2007. They did go on to win the Big 12 championship that season. They're one of just 4 teams to win 3 games by 30-plus points this season, along with number 1 Georgia, number 4 Michigan, and Minnesota. So that puts them in rarefied air. Coach Venables has talked about the added importance of what it means playing against his alma mater in Kansas State. In one of his interviews, highlighted a pretty interesting text exchange with Bill Snyder, who told him how proud he was of beating Nebraska, but said he would be disappointed if Venables put together a game plan to beat Kansas State this weekend. Meanwhile, Kansas State, the luster of a 40-12 win against Missouri is put in the rearview mirror when you lose at home as roughly 2-touchdown favorites against the Tulane Green Wave last week. You do want to try and figure out if that was a look-ahead spot or if that's what Kansas State's going to be going forward. The one reason that Kansas State fans should be optimistic is that Chris Kleiman, since taking over, has been extremely successful against the Sooners. New coaching staff, a lot of similar players, but in 2021, Oklahoma beats Kansas State 37-31, doesn't come close close to covering as a 12.5-point favorite. And Kansas State pulled off upsets in both 2020 and 2019, catching 27.5 in the game in 2020 and catching 23.5 in 2019, where they won by 17. Brad, the yardage against Tulane, pretty much dead even. Kansas State looked ill-equipped to really get anything going offensively. Credit to Willie Fritz's bunch. They bottled up Deuce Vaughn. But the one thing we've seen from Kansas State is they always pride themselves on physicality. Does this Oklahoma defense feel different now that they're able to match up in the trenches if Kansas State wants to play them in a phone booth?
It's early, but it does. And you know what? I'll use some comments made by Joel Klatt, who just called the Oklahoma defensive game against Nebraska in last week's game. I thought he made some interesting comments. It was kind of a throwaway video on Twitter, but he said after watching Oklahoma last week, Oklahoma defensively is now playing at a level, compared to what they've been under Lincoln Riley and later Bob Stoops years. They're playing at a level now that can win them a playoff game and actually be a legitimate national title contender. Something that, sure, that they made a bunch of playoff games, but we saw their last couple of games against SEC opponents wasn't close at all. So I thought it pretty telling on both fronts that Venables in just a couple of games has got the defense playing to this level already. I know they played a couple tomato cans, but Kent State offensively is okay. I know they run a lot of tempo. And then, Nebraska, for all their issues, it wasn't necessarily offense, at least the first few games. It was more on the defensive side of the ball, and obviously Oklahoma was able to shut them down. But I also took it as a shot against Lincoln Riley and Alex Grinch's inability to play defense. I question, you brought up the recent series history. I wonder if under Lincoln Riley, Kansas State was obviously a bad matchup for Oklahoma. I'm not so sure that's the case now if Oklahoma's going to play defense like this, if Kansas State's going to be able to have success offensively, particularly when you watch how much Kansas State has struggled in the passing game. I mean, they're bottom 5 in the country. If you're just looking at pass yards per game, I mean, heck, Army and Navy are averaging more passing yards per game than Kansas State right now. And my goodness, if you can't throw the football in Oklahoma, they'll stack guys in the box to stop Deuce Vaughn. I don't see how Kansas State has success offensively against what looks like a much improved Oklahoma defense.
It's so interesting because I expected Adrian Martinez to kind of give them an element under center. You read all of the comments coming out of Manhattan during the offseason. They wanted to play a little bit faster. They didn't want to try and be that very methodical offense because they thought they had playmakers. That hasn't quite been the case through the first couple of games of the season, and now you step up in class, a much different task going into Norman, being expected to match Oklahoma score for score. And Payne, Brad highlighted Oklahoma's defense looking and feeling different under Brent Venables. A defensive-minded head coach wants to put his fingerprints all over a team. And I'll make the case that offensively they haven't been as dynamic, at least through the first 2 games, as I expected. You score 7 points over the first 30 minutes against Kent, it gives me reason for concern. But suddenly last week, and I know it's a Nebraska team defensively that doesn't offer much resistance, they showed balance, they showed physicality, and more importantly, they didn't even do much in the passing game and still had plenty of success going into Lincoln and hanging 49 on the Cornhuskers.
I didn't watch the game, so you're a better man than me watching that sink ship or that ship sink. Yeah, I listen. I look at this game and I did watch a little bit of Kansas State last week. It looked like they fell asleep at the wheel against Tulane. Obviously, Oklahoma pummeled Nebraska, and those 2 outcomes have created, a 13.5 point spread. I would have made this game 9.5 before the 2 games last week, and I don't know what that means, right? I haven't gone to the window with Kansas State, and obviously you guys are causing me some concern there. I still think you have 2 contrasting styles, right? Oklahoma wants to speed this game up with Lebby and Gabriel. Right now, they're 9th in plays per minute. Kansas State, even though they've said all the right things this offseason that you alluded to, Todd, they're playing slow, 109th in plays per minute. You still have to go with what you're best at. And I still think running Deuce Vaughn, who's all-world, is probably the right approach. He led the Power 5 with 59 plays of 10-plus yards last season. He was the number 1 running back in wins above replacement in the entire country. He's their workhorse, right? So you have to get him the ball. Kansas State has been efficient running it, despite a lack of moving it through the air, right? Positive 0.31 EPA per rush. Even though there's been improvement for Oklahoma's defense, they're still outside the top 55 in rushing success rate allowed. Their defensive line has allowed 3.4 line yards per rush. So there is this disparity still, even though we believe it's improved, especially on standard downs. I think when you look at Kansas State, they may have some success there. I think the other thing here is Kansas State has shown an ability, at least in some situations, to be a little bit better with power success. I think that's the formula. You have to shorten this game. You have to get Deuce Vaughn to touch it. You have to wear down Oklahoma's defense a little bit. Keep Oklahoma's very rhythmic offense on the sideline. Certainly they came out on fire last week, converted a huge swing play where, Nebraska goes down, scores a touchdown at 7-0. You can get off the field on 3rd and 7, and Dylan Gabriel rips off a 60-plus yard touchdown that just kind of flips that game a little bit on its head, where Nebraska had all the early momentum if you get a stop there. But I think that's the formula here, and we saw. Oklahoma's offense was not very good early on against Kent State because it is this rhythmic offense. So you have to keep them on the sideline. The other element here is Adrian Martinez has to be himself. Had off-season surgery. That took away some valuable reps in a new system, but you saw Coach Kleinman come out this week, and he flat out said, we need Adrian Martinez, the guy we thought we were getting, to play that way. We got to get him to cut it loose and be free. If he makes a mistake, he makes a mistake. And I think it's interesting because we've seen Martinez, we've bashed over the years for turning the ball over. He hasn't turned the ball over yet. That's awesome. But he's also averaging 4.5 yards per pass attempt because he's not attacking, because he's fearful of the turnovers. There's a reason Nebraska wanted him out. He knows that reason. But when eventually Oklahoma puts more guys in the box to slow down Deuce Vaughn, Martinez has to take those downfield one-on-one shots because Oklahoma's defense is still allowing some explosives through the air. We think the receiver group is decent for Kansas State. This game is on Deuce Vaughn. It's on the running game to slow this down, keep Oklahoma on the sideline. But I think Adrian Martinez has to come out of the shell. And again, if he turns the ball over, so be it. But he's got to take those shots so Oklahoma's defense can't play in a phone.
There's reason for optimism for Kansas State. There are still some questions for me around Dylan Gabriel. When you look at his numbers, gentlemen, under 60% completions for the first time in his 3 Oklahoma starts, was just 16 of 27 last week against Nebraska. Now, I know he didn't have to be at his best when they had run away and hidden by the time we got to halftime. 230 passing yards, his lowest total yet as a Sooner. We'll see how life in the Big 12 is, and if that physicality that Kansas State is known for can disrupt some of that rhythm and really turn this game into a slog where they would feel much more comfortable than trying to match the Sooners score for score. Gentlemen, 6 games broken down as extensively as we know how. I should say 6.5, so to speak, with the non-powers 5 in there between JMU and Appalachian State. Brad, before we bid you a fond farewell on this fine Wednesday, any other news, notes, nuggets that you would like to share with the loyal Bet the Board listenership, my friend?
No, I am just anxiously awaiting the Florida State quarterback news, not only for Payne, but for my own personal bets, because I was under the inclination that Jordan Travis might not play this week, but the market's saying different. So, as usual, Payne, I will be well in tune to your Florida State Seminoles this weekend.
Need to get to 4-0. Nice things have not happened to Florida State and Mike Norvell recently. 3-0, you're just expecting just a landslide of shit to hit him. We saw the injury bug hit. A nice score last night with Blake Nicholson, a big decision from Hakeem Williams on Friday. If you somehow land both of those guys, it would be inconceivable to me that somehow Florida State covers this game on Saturday. Just that many good things can't all unfold for Mike Norvell.
It's survive in advance, Payne. I mean, no one's looking for Florida State to go out there and win this game by 3 touchdowns. You need a win to go to 4-0.
Well, Brad is. This is a gambling podcast.
No, he said he's rooting for Boston College to slide inside that number, my friend.
Oh, that's right. Yes. I'm sorry.
Spinning things up.
What number did you take there, Brad?
I'm always the guy that takes great numbers. I took 17 and 15. I had made it 14 if Travis wasn't going to play. I mean, because I do remember specifically somebody during the middle of the Louisville game last week said Jordan Travis was worth 10 points to a point spread. So the guy that follows that team religiously, I took his word for it.
Oh, you did. That was my advice. You didn't like Tate Rodemaker from what you saw in the Duquesne game, although he did deliver you a cover.
I didn't like anything I saw from Tate Rodemaker, not only in that game, but any point in his career. I was live betting Louisville like you wouldn't believe, and let's just say I lost my butt.
So the same here. Played Louisville live, played them at halftime. I think the interesting component there is, you always get the trolls on social media who are like, see, you overreacted. And, they're overreacting to like a 7-throw sample from Tate Rodemaker where, we're getting 3 years of intel every day at practice. He hasn't been that guy. And I would credit Mike Norvell and that staff for going very paint by numbers in the second half because Louisville had to load the box to stop the run. Their front seven's not very good. And they were blitzing a safety down in the box. And so the second half, they took the game plan away from him basically because that was the Jordan Travis game plan who started 11 for 11 through the air. But they made it a one-read system. It was very simple. If the safety crashes down, you're going to throw a slant or an in. If the safety does not crash down, you're going to hand the ball off. And I think with Jeff Hafley, a defensive coordinator that we really respect, with getting some tape on Tate Rodemaker, there's going to be some things there with disguised coverages. And it's still, even though Boston College struggles offensively, it's still a very veteran defensive group. And I think Jeff Hafley's mentioned that this is his best unit that he's had during his tenure at Boston College. So that'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. Obviously, not just Jordan Travis, right? You have left tackle Robert Scott has not been at practice yet this week. We know the right tackle, Bless Harris, was lost for the season. Caden Lyles, who was fighting for the starting center job, out for the season. Jared Verse did return to practice on Tuesday with a brace, but we'll see if he goes. Fabian Lovett, your all-world defensive tackle, did not travel to Louisville. I would expect that he's out. Marion Cooper, your lead corner for Florida State, has not really played that many snaps this season because he's not 100%. So the injury bug has really hit Florida State.
Let me tell you, if Jordan Travis isn't 100%, you don't run him out there as a 17.5-point favorite against Boston College, knowing that Wake Forest, NC State, and Clemson are waiting in the wings. So it'll be interesting to see how the Florida State Seminoles handle a little bit of prosperity, something that they haven't had working in their favor over the last handful of seasons. You can follow Brad.
Here's the test.
Ahead.
If the spread right now, as I look at it, is 17.5. If Jordan Travis is announced out, where do we think this goes?
To go to 14.5, so it allows Brad to have a good number there.
Yep, I agree.
14.5.
Where do you want it to go? It's not going to 7.
It's not going to 7, but I think if you think that drop off's 3 points, you guys are
We'll find out. I mean, maybe Tate Rodemaker's value to the point spread is the best kept secret. So I'm definitely now going to have to watch with bated breath.
I think everyone doesn't realize what Jordan Travis is. Dig into the data, and we're all stunned, right? I mean, this is a transfer from Louisville that no one knew could throw a pass. Even last year, Mike Norvell didn't know what he had, right? He was kind of toggling between quarterbacks even last season, but right now, you look at him metrically like he's one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the country, according to PFF.
He has played exceptionally well. Interesting game there, an interesting game for Brad's favorite team as well, one that we didn't have time to cover in Notre Dame and North Carolina, to see if the Irish can get their first big resume win under Marcus Freeman's leadership. You can follow Brad on Twitter. That's at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Brad, thanks as always for your time, my good man. Best of luck with your investments this weekend, and we'll look forward to catching up with you next week. Same time, same place. Talk a little college football week 5.
Thanks, guys. Look forward to it.
One of these podcasts, Payne, with or without Brad, we're going to find a way to avoid any mention of Florida State alums, Florida State recruiting, or anything that has to go in and around the program in Osceola and good old Tallahassee.
I'm all for it. You guys asked a question. I provided a detailed answer. That simple.
I think Brad wanted your expertise. We know it doesn't sit well with Brad or any of us. We don't get the best of the numbers. So, of course, we'll watch and see exactly what the situation will look like under center for the Seminoles. Other games that we didn't have a chance to hit on that I think will be interesting to watch. I know we talked about Washington at the top of the show and how much more dynamic their offense has been. Let's see how they handle a bit of prosperity. As nearly 2 touchdown favorites, they'll welcome in Stanford. David Shaw and that offenses look significantly better, more dynamic, and this point spread would have been much different if the Cardinal would have converted 2 first-half drives against the USC Trojans. So I'm curious to see how that game goes. And when you look elsewhere on the landscape, some interesting stuff taking place on Friday night between Virginia and Syracuse. A number of games, as we always say, measuring sticks more than anything else as we continue to compile more data points for teams as we inch ever so close to the end of September and the heart of conference play, where a lot of these coaches will either earn their keep or will see things get off the rails sooner rather than later. All right, my friend, it's that time of the show where we try and provide, as if we haven't already, an actionable element, but hopefully with the 6+ breakdowns we've done, we've tipped our hand a little bit on ways that we would lean, potential positions we may have, but as far as truly investable opportunities and best bets, how are you seeing the board this Saturday?
So I think this is probably a good time to have a little bit of a discussion before we get to the best bet. We understand that they have not gone very well to start the season, and mentioning the 3 letters of CLV go as well as about a political debate. So the one thing we will say is we've beaten the closing line in all these games. We've been here since 2014. We've never had a losing season. I would still make us a large favorite to have a winning season. And I think, as you alluded to, Todd, it's not just the best bet. And maybe we label this something else because it's just this blinking red light. It's a bullhorn. And we're not talking to the loyal listeners that absorb every second of this podcast and listen to it multiple times. But there's obviously people, when you timestamp a best bet, it's the only thing they listen to, 13 seconds, and that's how they gauge the podcast. But as we alluded to, right, if you listened to the breakdowns last week, you probably found yourself on a Miami under. You probably found yourself on Washington and Oregon. There's plenty of actionable advice. And the one thing bringing Brad into the fold, we wanted to alleviate pressure from him. We knew his last situation. But if you think he's picking out a non-Powers 5 game of 80 just out of random hats, right? He's won both of those. He's helped us the last 2 weeks. He's won both of those games. So even though it doesn't say best bet, right, some deductive reasoning and an IQ above 7 will probably lead you to 2 winners there. Anyways, my point being here is we have not done well. We understand that. We've probably lost more money than all of you guys combined. We are going to war with you guys in these games. We're not just your normal content creators giving out games. We bet these games. So we've lost as much money, probably more than you guys. In saying that, we look to get back on the positive side here.
One other thing, though. Can I add something to that real quick? And
Go
I
ahead,
think,
absolutely.
when we peel back the curtain and we go through the process, I mean, we're not flipping the mics on, as our listeners know. The depth of information and knowledge that they hopefully have gleaned from us over the years, going back to our inception in 2014, not only in the NFL and college football, but every other sport that we delve into, you see a lot of the information that's circulated after our podcasts go live. And the process that we go through, and we try and comb through a board of, let's call it 50 to 60 games, paring down that list, identifying, an actionable element, so to speak. For all of that, there's a level of frustration that falls on us, and we're not here to sugarcoat it. We're not going to say that, hey, look, it was a bad beat last week on the game. It was the wrong side. Nebraska thinks steamrolled on them quickly. But just know we're with you guys every step of the way. We love the relationship we've built with most of you loyal listeners, the back and forth on social media. If you guys have questions, we're there to answer them. And this doesn't apply to everybody out there, but we know there's folks that are listening to the show. Hey, you guys are hacks. You can't win the best bet. If that's how you feel, you're entitled to your opinion. But for those folks that have been with us, again, don't want it to diminish anything else we've done. And like Payne said at the top, I mean, we're going to continue to do everything we can. You build a winning streak starting with 1, and it's going to happen, sooner rather than later, hopefully starting with this show. Sorry.
No, you're fine. And the process has not changed. In fact, it's enhanced. I mean, when we started this in 2014, we didn't have as much influence in the market. We didn't have as many contacts. Probably power numbers weren't as good. I mean, everything that we're doing now is enhanced to a level that's been better than any other year. And the process is still the same. And there's a reason we have not had a losing season since we've started this. I mean, you just go back to last year. I mean, regular season best bets between the NFL and college football, 65%, right? A return on investment of nearly 23%. So it's a short sample size, and we say this all the time. Candidly, like, as long as we'll be here on this podcast, you'll never see a sample size relevant enough to dictate, hey, these guys are winners or losers. And that's why CLV is important, because when you are in these losing streaks and you are beating the closing number, that is the perfect short sample size indicator. And when you are 0-3 and you bet a game, you still get respect in the market. It tells you the information you're listening to has value. So with that being said, it's an ugly game. It's a late evening game on the East Coast. Let's go to rotation number 376. We broke down this game in great detail with Todd, myself, and Brad. Let's go with the Oregon State Beavers. I think the smart, prudent decision here is to buy to 7. There are some 7s out there currently in the market.
You're going to get me kicked out of my house. You're going to get me kicked out of my
Caesars.
house for this, by the way, just so you know.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So this is a game that, we made, I'll just be candid, 3.5. And we can get to 7 on the buy minus 20. And just to think about those prices in general, once you get to about 24 cents on the buy, 25 cents is basically the equilibrium of 6.5 minus 10, 7 minus 25. So anything better than minus 24, I think there's some value there. Obviously, you have to equate for a total a little bit higher, but Oregon State plus 7 minus 20, the official play on the buy if you have to get there. If not, there are a couple places that are using 7 flat right now. So we broke this game down for about 15 minutes. Go back into the podcast. It's time-stamped for you, but that will be the best bet this week. Oregon Beavers, plus the 7.
Let's do it. Let's see my man get things done at Research Stadium and pull one of the bigger upsets that we've seen so far in college football. Not necessarily by point spread, but in terms of seismic impact it can have on the chase for the national championship. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Of course, follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. NFL on the horizon for Thursday as we get an NFL Week 3. Stay green, and the NASCAR playoff race from Texas will be available for you first thing Friday morning as well. Payne, any words of wisdom? Parting shots, things you'd like to get off your chest in a safe space before you get rid of me for the next 24 hours?
No, that's it. Let's get out of Dodge. NFL tomorrow.
All right. Best of luck to all of you, our loyal listeners. Thank you guys for tuning in each and every show throughout the course of the fall. And with an Oregon State ticket in hand out in the Pacific Northwest come Saturday night, hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.